Fix my Porsche, and I'll marry you. Lydia Carter laughed, the words falling out of her mouth, the way careless things do lightly, without weight, the kind of joke rich people make when they're bored and impatient, and slightly amused by their own misfortune. She was standing in the gravel lot of the smallest, most forgettable garage she had ever set foot in, wearing a blazer that cost more than the monthly rent of the building in front of her, looking at a man in oil-stained coveralls who hadn't even glanced up from the hood of her car yet. The people inside the garage, two young mechanics leaning against a tool chest, an older man eating a sandwich near the door, all laughed. It was the kind of laugh that fills a room when someone powerful says something absurd. But the man in the coveralls, the one everyone called Ethan, didn't laugh. He just looked up at her once, his eyes calm and unreadable, and then he looked back down at the engine. He said nothing. He just began to work. Lydia Carter had not become a CEO at 35 by tolerating uncertainty. She had built her reputation in the technology sector through a combination of ruthless clarity, genuine intelligence, and an almost supernatural ability to identify what was broken and fix it before anyone else noticed the crack. Her company, Carter Systems, had grown from a small software consultancy into a mid-sized tech conglomerate with contracts across 3 continents and a valuation that had quadrupled in 4 years under her leadership. She was profiled in business magazines. She was invited to speak at conferences. She owned a penthouse apartment in a city that rewarded ambition, and she drove when she drove herself, which was rarely a 1964 Porsche 356 coupe that had once belonged to a European collector and was now worth somewhere north of $1,200,000. The car was not a status symbol in the conventional sense. Lydia genuinely loved it. She loved the way the engine sounded when it was running right. That low, purposeful growl that made her feel like the world was cooperating with her plans. She loved the history of it, the craftsmanship, the intention behind every bolt. It was the one indulgence she permitted herself that had nothing to do with profit or strategy, which was why, when the Porsche died on a 2-lane road 40 minutes outside the city, somewhere between a soybean field and a weathered grain elevator, Lydia did not handle it particularly well. She called 3 separate service centers before she even stepped out of the car. 2 told her they didn't have technicians qualified to work on that model. A third sent a man who spent 45 minutes poking at the engine before telling her he didn't want to be responsible for damaging something that valuable. A 4th service was dispatched from the nearest Porsche dealership. And the technician, polite, thorough, genuinely trying, shook his head and said the problem was somewhere deep in the electrical system, that it would need to be trucked back to the city and examined at a specialist facility. That would take days. Lydia had a board presentation in 36 hours. She stood by the roadside watching the afternoon light go golden over the empty fields and felt something she almost never felt: helpless. A local woman stopped to ask if she needed anything, heard the situation, and said with the quiet certainty of someone who knows a place the way only lifelong residents do, "You should try Ethan's place, on Route 9. He fixes things nobody else can fix." Lydia was not accustomed to taking automotive advice from strangers on rural roads, but she had no better options. She had the car towed to the address she was given, which turned out to be a small garage set back from the highway, flanked by 2 old oak trees, with a hand-painted sign above the bay door that said simply, Brooks Auto. The lot was gravel. The building was old but clean. There were tools hung with evident care on pegboards inside, and the concrete floor had been swept recently. It was not impressive by any standard Lydia normally applied to her environment, but it was not chaotic either. There was a kind of order to it, the order of a person who respects their work even when no one is watching. Ethan Brooks came out of the back when he heard the tow truck. He was perhaps 38, lean and unhurried in the way that people who work with their hands tend to be, with the kind of face that doesn't announce itself, but that you find yourself looking at more than once. He wiped his hands on a cloth and listened to the tow truck driver explain the situation without interrupting. Then he looked at the car. Just looked at it, for a long moment, the way someone looks at a puzzle they've seen before, but not in this particular configuration. Then he said he'd take a look. Lydia, who had been on 3 phone calls since arriving, lowered her phone and said, 7 specialists have already tried. I'm not optimistic. Ethan nodded, without any visible irritation, and said, "All right." Then he asked her what sounds the car had been making in the weeks before the breakdown. She told him. He asked 2 more questions, specific, quiet, precise, and then he walked to the front of the car and opened the hood. It was when Lydia made the joke. She was tired and frustrated and slightly under-caffeinated, and the sight of this ordinary-looking man, in this ordinary-looking garage, preparing to examine a car that had defeated trained Porsche technicians, struck her as both touching and mildly ridiculous. "Fix my Porsche, and I'll marry you," she said, and everyone laughed. Ethan looked up at her just once, just briefly, and the look was not wounded or amused or impressed. It was simply aware. Then he looked back at the engine. He reached in with one hand and touched something she couldn't see. And he went very still. And he listened. Ethan Brooks worked on the Porsche for a little under 3 hours. He did not use diagnostic software. He did not consult a manual. He worked with a set of hand tools that were old and well-maintained, and he moved through the engine with a focus that was quiet and absolute. Lydia stayed. She told herself it was because she had nowhere else to go, which was technically true. But the longer she watched, the more she found herself genuinely curious. She had been around competent people her entire adult life, engineers, strategists, developers, analysts, and she recognized the quality of attention Ethan brought to his work. It was not the performance of expertise. It was expertise itself, stripped of everything unnecessary. He found the problem in the second hour. It was, he explained without any particular drama, a relay component in the ignition control circuit that had been installed incorrectly during a service appointment, not recently, but years ago, possibly as long as a decade back. The component itself wasn't defective. It had simply been seated at a fractional misalignment that caused intermittent contact failure under specific thermal conditions. Over time, the misalignment had created microscopic wear on the connector housing. 7 specialists had missed it because they were looking for a broken part. The part wasn't broken, it was just wrong. Lydia listened to this explanation and felt something shift in her thinking, the faint, involuntary adjustment that happens when you encounter someone who sees differently than you expected. She said, "How did you know to look there?" Ethan said, "The sound it made when it was warm. The frequency was slightly off. It pointed to that circuit." She looked at him. He was already turning back to the engine. An hour later, he asked one of his assistants to try starting the car. The young man got in, turned the key, and the Porsche 356 came back to life. Not just running better than it had run in years. The engine tone smoother and more even, the idle steady and clean. The 2 young mechanics who had been watching from the doorway looked at each other. The older man near the entrance put down his coffee. Lydia stood in the gravel lot and listened to the sound of her car and felt something that was very close to embarrassment, though not the unpleasant kind. It was the embarrassment of having underestimated something, of having laughed when she should have waited. When she tried to pay Ethan, she named a figure that reflected the value of the car and the impossibility of the repair, a figure that was, in any honest accounting, several times more than fair. He looked at the number she wrote on the check, and then he looked at her and he said he'd take his standard hourly rate plus parts, which came to considerably less than $200. She told him that wasn't acceptable. He told her that was his price. They stood in the gravel lot with the Porsche idling between them and had a brief negotiation that Lydia, for perhaps the first time in her professional life, lost. She paid what he asked. She got into her car. She drove about a quarter-mile down Route 9 before she pulled over, sat with her hands on the wheel, and asked herself a question she hadn't expected to be asking. Who exactly was that man? She found out, in pieces, over the following week. She went back to the garage 2 days later, under the pretext of having a noise checked. A noise that she had, if she was honest with herself, invented. Ethan heard it, drove the car around the block, and told her there was no noise. She laughed and said she must have imagined it. He said that happened sometimes. He didn't seem annoyed. She lingered longer than she should have, asking questions she framed as casual about the town, about the garage, about how long he'd been there, and he answered them with the same unhurried economy he brought to everything. He had been in Millhaven for 6 years. He had opened the garage himself. He had lived there before that, briefly, after leaving a company he'd been part of in the city. When she asked what kind of company, he said software and hardware integration. And then he changed the subject in a way that was so smooth, she almost missed the transition. What she couldn't find out from him, she found out from other people. A woman who ran the diner 2 blocks from the garage told her Ethan had grown up in the state, gone to the State Technical University on a full scholarship, and graduated at the top of his program. A retired engineer who came into the garage for oil changes told her Ethan had once been part of a startup that built proprietary interface systems for industrial automation, that the company had been, for about 18 months, one of the more talked about early-stage ventures in its space. That it had been valued, at its peak, at somewhere between $80 and $100 million, and then, apparently, it had not been. The retired engineer lowered his voice slightly when he said the next part, that Ethan's co-founder, a man named Daniel Foster, who had brought in outside investors and navigated the legal structure of the company, had used that structure to gradually dilute Ethan's ownership stake, while Ethan was focused on the technical work. The mechanics of it were not complicated. In retrospect, Foster had negotiated investment terms that created preferred share classes. He had managed the cap table. He had signed agreements on behalf of the company during periods when Ethan was traveling or heads down in development, and he had done so in ways that were technically within the authority granted to him, but that systematically eroded Ethan's position. By the time Ethan understood what was happening, the legal position had become very difficult. He had spent 2 years in litigation. He had not won. He had walked away with a settlement that covered his legal fees and not much else. And he had come to Millhaven and opened a garage, and as far as anyone could tell, had never looked back. Lydia sat with this information for a long time. She had been in business long enough to know that stories like this one were not uncommon, that the landscape of the tech industry was littered with brilliant technical founders who had been outmaneuvered by partners with sharper legal instincts and fewer scruples. She had seen it happen. She had, if she was being fully honest, once or twice operated on the harder edges of that same culture herself, though never with malice and never against someone who hadn't understood the game. What unsettled her about Ethan's story was not the betrayal, it was the aftermath. Because most people who lost what Ethan had lost either fought their way back or spent their energy being angry. Ethan had done neither. He had gone quiet. He had gone small, by choice, and stayed there, and by every account she heard, he seemed genuinely content. She was still thinking about this when her phone rang, and everything else became urgent. The crisis at Carter Systems began, as most crises do, not with a single catastrophic event, but with a series of small failures that had been accumulating quietly beneath the surface. A major infrastructure project, one that represented nearly 18% of the company's projected revenue for the coming fiscal year, had stalled badly, then collapsed. The technical lead had resigned 3 weeks before completion. The handoff documentation was incomplete. The client, a logistics firm with government contracts, pulled out of the agreement with a penalty clause that Carter Systems' legal team had somehow failed to flag during contract review. The stock dropped 11% in 2 days. 2 board members called Lydia to express concern, which in the language of board members meant something considerably more serious than concern. 3 institutional investors requested briefings. A prominent financial publication ran a piece questioning her leadership judgment, citing anonymous sources from within the company. It was, in the measurement of corporate disasters, a middling-sized catastrophe. But Lydia had built Carter Systems on a reputation for stability and competence, and a middling-sized catastrophe at the wrong moment could become a large one before you could see it coming. She was not sleeping well. She arrived at the office earlier than usual and stayed later. She ran back-to-back meetings with her executive team, her legal team, her investor relations team, and a succession of external consultants who charged considerable sums to tell her variations of the same thing, that the market needed to see decisive action, that the company's communication strategy needed to be more proactive, and that she needed to demonstrate confidence. She sat through presentations with slides full of frameworks and recovery roadmaps, each one slightly different in language and completely identical in instinct, and she nodded at appropriate intervals and said the right things in return, and came home each night to her apartment with the feeling that she had spent a great deal of energy on something that was not the actual problem. Her assistant noticed she was eating less at her desk. Her general counsel, a careful woman who had been with Carter Systems for 6 years, stopped by her office one evening and asked if she was all right, and received an answer that was accurate and insufficient at the same time. The consultants were not wrong, exactly, but their recommendations felt generic and expensive and disconnected from the actual problem, and Lydia, who had always trusted her instincts about problems, had the persistent feeling that she was being advised to treat symptoms while the underlying condition went undiagnosed. She ended up at Brooks Auto on a Thursday afternoon, not having planned to go there. Having simply found herself driving toward Millhaven after a particularly unproductive board call, she pulled into the gravel lot and sat in the car for a moment before going in. Ethan was in the back, working on something that appeared to be a transmission. He came out when he heard the bell above the bay door, wiped his hands, and looked at her once. Then he said, "You want some coffee?" She said yes. They sat on 2 metal stools near the workbench, and she told him everything. She had not intended to. She was not in the habit of discussing company problems with people outside her organization, but the words came out anyway, methodically at first and then faster, the whole machinery of the crisis laid out in the space between them. She told him about the failed project, the client loss, the stock drop, the board pressure, the consultants, and their recommendations. She told him what the financial people were saying, and what the communications people were saying, and what her gut was saying, which was that none of it was quite right. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does the data from your project management systems look like for the 6 months before the technical lead resigned?" She blinked. She said she would need to pull it up. He said she should. Then he said, "I think the problem isn't in the market. The problem is inside your team." She looked at him. He said it calmly, without any of the performance that consultants used when they wanted to seem insightful. He said it the way he had described the relay component in her Porsche engine, as if it were simply a fact he had identified, waiting to be acknowledged. What Ethan laid out over the next hour was not a theory. It was an analysis. He asked questions about the project's timeline, about personnel decisions, about which members of the management team had been most involved in the infrastructure account. He asked about reporting structures and about which data the board received versus which data was filtered through the executive layer. He asked about the contract review process that had missed the penalty clause, and specifically about who had approved the review. Lydia answered each question, and as she did, a pattern began to emerge, not loudly, not with any single obvious smoking gun, but clearly, the way a shape becomes visible in a photograph once you understand what you're looking at. The infrastructure project had been managed by a senior vice president named Marcus Webb, who had been with the company for 4 years and had, over that time, built a small but loyal constellation of direct reports who shared information with him before sharing it upward. Webb had approved the contract review. Webb had made the personnel decision that put the underqualified technical lead in charge of the project. Webb had managed the client relationship. Lydia said she trusted Webb. Ethan said she might be right, but he said the data pattern was worth examining closely. And he showed her, using nothing more than the numbers she had described aloud, and a notepad where he drew a simple diagram of information flows, exactly where the anomalies were, reporting delays that shouldn't have existed, approval chains that bypassed standard oversight, budget allocations that didn't align with documented scope. She stared at the diagram. She thought about the 7 Porsche specialists who had all looked at the same engine and not found the problem. She thought about how Ethan had found it in 2 hours, not because he had better tools, but because he had asked different questions. She launched an internal audit the following Monday. She did not announce it as such. She framed it as a process review, a routine examination of project management protocols in light of the recent losses. She brought in a small external team with forensic accounting experience, gave them narrow and specific access, and told no one in the executive layer except her general counsel. The audit took 11 days. It confirmed everything Ethan had outlined on the notepad, and then some. Marcus Webb had been managing information asymmetry for nearly 2 years, not embezzling, not committing fraud in any easily prosecutable sense, but strategically shaping what the board saw, and when they saw it, in ways that protected his position and inflated his reported performance at the expense of the company's actual outcomes. 3 members of his team had been active participants. The penalty clause in the logistics contract had not been missed. It had been noted in the initial review, and then quietly removed from the summary document that went to Lydia. Webb was placed on administrative leave pending further review. The 3 team members were similarly suspended. Carter Systems issued a measured statement about process improvements and organizational review. The stock recovered most of its losses within a week, once the market understood that the crisis was contained and the cause identified. 2 board members who had been quietly preparing a motion to restrict Lydia's authority stood down. The consultant sent invoices for the advice she hadn't used. Lydia sent a text message to a number she had recently saved in her phone. "You were right about all of it." The reply came 40 minutes later. "Glad the company is okay." It was not until the following week that Lydia saw Daniel Foster for the first time in person. Though she had heard his name before from a business contact who mentioned him at an industry dinner, from an article she had read about a successful acquisition he had orchestrated, from the stories she had pieced together about Ethan's past, Foster was polished in the way that certain people in the technology business are polished, articulate, well-dressed, accustomed to rooms that defer to him, with a social fluency that could be mistaken for warmth. He was at a technology investment forum that Lydia attended, holding court in a small circle near the bar, and when she was introduced to him, he was gracious and appropriately flattering about Carter Systems' recovery. She smiled and moved on. What she didn't know until later was that Foster had recognized Ethan's name. When she mentioned it in passing, she had referred to him obliquely as a consultant who had helped her identify the internal management problem, and that recognition had produced something in Foster that looked like confidence, but was, underneath, its opposite. Foster had spent 6 years building a new reputation on top of the foundation he had taken from someone else. The return of Ethan Brooks into any space where influential people might hear his name represented a risk that Foster found intolerable. He began making calls. Within 10 days of the investment forum, 3 separate stories appeared in technology business publications, questioning Ethan's credentials and past vague, carefully worded pieces that didn't make direct accusations but raised pointed questions about an unnamed individual who had allegedly overstated his role in a significant early-stage company nearly a decade ago. The pieces were not signed by anyone Lydia recognized. They were written in the passive voice of laundered reputation damage. They cited unnamed sources and referenced documents that were not attached. Lydia read them and understood immediately what they were. She had seen this kind of thing before, not directed at someone she knew personally, but as a tactic, as a tool in the arsenal of people who felt threatened by the truth of something. She called a journalist she trusted and asked for background. The journalist, who had been in the technology press for 15 years, told her within 48 hours that the 3 pieces traced back to a PR firm that had previously worked for Foster's holding company. When she went to Ethan with this information, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had expected something like this, eventually. He didn't seem particularly surprised or particularly upset. He seemed, if anything, tired in the way that people are tired of things they have been carrying for a long time. She told him she wanted to help. He said he appreciated that, but that he was used to handling his own problems. She said she knew. She helped anyway. Daniel Foster stood at the podium of the annual Midwest Technology Innovation Conference on a clear October morning and was, by any external measure, in command. He had been given a keynote slot on the strength of his recent acquisition's success, and he delivered a polished, confident talk about the future of industrial technology integration, a talk that, had it been given in a vacuum, would have received the warm applause of an audience predisposed to admire what it already knew. He was smooth at the podium in the way that people are smooth when they have rehearsed their version of events for years. When the narrative has been polished into something that no longer feels like revision but like memory. The room was full of the kind of people who attend conferences like this. Investors, founders, journalists, technology executives, advisors of various kinds. Lydia Carter was in the third row. She had brought a folder with her. Foster finished his prepared remarks and opened the floor to questions. 3 questions in, a woman near the back of the room who had been introduced in the program as a technology historian asked him about the early development of the interface systems that had originally made industrial automation integration viable, specifically about a company called ClearPath Systems, which the conference notes listed as a formative enterprise in the space. Foster answered smoothly, crediting the company's success to a strong team and sound investment strategy. The historian asked a follow-up. Could he speak to the technical architecture that had distinguished ClearPath from its competitors? Foster began to answer, and then seemed, almost imperceptibly, to hesitate. He described the architecture in general terms. The historian said, with the patience of someone who has waited a long time for something. I'm asking because the original patent filings, which are public record, list the primary architect as someone named Ethan Brooks. Are you familiar with his contributions? The room shifted. Ethan was not in it. He was, as far as anyone knew, 40 minutes away in his garage. But his name was, suddenly, everywhere in it. Foster composed himself quickly and said that ClearPath had had many contributors and that patents didn't always capture the full picture of collaborative work. Someone in the room pulled up the patent filings on a tablet and passed it to the person beside them. A journalist in the second row leaned forward. Lydia opened her folder, stood up, and was recognized by the moderator. She said she wanted to offer some context, if the conference would permit it. And she read from a document a chronological account of ClearPath Systems' founding, technical development, and equity history. Compiled from public records, court filings, and original incorporation documents that took about 7 minutes to read aloud in a room that was completely silent by the 3rd minute. By the end of it, the picture was clear, and it was detailed, and it left no meaningful room for the interpretation Foster had been offering. He had taken something. The record said so. The record had always said so, for anyone who knew where to look and cared enough to look carefully. Foster left the stage before the session ended. 2 journalists followed him into the hallway. Lydia sat back down and folded her papers into the folder and listened to the conversation around her rearrange itself. Afterward, outside the conference hall in the thin October light, a board member from a major technology investment firm came to find her and asked quietly who had compiled the document she had read. She said it had been a collaborative effort. The board member nodded and said he would be interested in speaking further with anyone who had that depth of knowledge about the space. She said she would pass that along. Then, she drove to Millhaven. Ethan was closing the garage when she arrived. He was locking the bay door, and he turned when he heard her car. She told him what had happened. He listened, and for a moment his face did something that she didn't have a word for, not relief exactly, and not triumph, but something quieter than both. He said, "You didn't have to do that." She said, "I know." They stood in the gravel lot as the light went down, and she thought about all the ways she had learned to calculate the value of a person by their credentials, their assets, their networks, their ability to perform in rooms full of important people, and how thoroughly and repeatedly Ethan Brooks had broken every one of those calculations without appearing to try. The weeks after the conference moved differently than the weeks before them. Lydia found reasons to be in Millhaven more often than could be entirely explained by proximity or convenience. She told herself, and her assistant, that she was evaluating a property investment in the area, which was true, in the sense that she had mentioned it once to a real estate contact, but the actual geography of her visits centered reliably around Route 9 and the hand-painted sign above the oak trees. Ethan fixed a small oil leak in the Porsche that she had genuinely noticed. He taught her, one afternoon, how to check the valve clearances herself, guiding her hands to the right places under the hood and explaining what she was feeling for. She was not mechanically gifted, and they both knew it, but she paid attention in a way that clearly surprised him. And at some point the lesson became a conversation, and the conversation became the kind of easy, unhurried back and forth that she had not had with anyone in longer than she cared to calculate. She began to understand things about him that couldn't be conveyed in a background report or a secondhand story. She saw him turn away a customer who wanted quick, cheap work on brake components that were genuinely unsafe, explaining patiently that he wouldn't do it but offering to do it correctly for what the parts cost him. She saw him spend an hour after closing helping a high school student who had come in with a salvage yard engine and a library book, walking the kid through a compression test with the unhurried gravity of someone who takes learning seriously. She watched him explain the same concept 3 different ways without any visible frustration, adjusting his language each time until the student's face changed from confusion to comprehension, and she recognized in that patience something she had rarely seen in the high-pressure environments. She inhabited the patience of someone who genuinely believed the other person was worth the time. She found out, from the woman at the diner rather than from Ethan, that he had been quietly subsidizing a scholarship fund at the local technical high school for 4 years, putting money in under a donor name that nobody connected to him until she asked specifically and carefully, a small amount each month, consistent over years, enough to fund 2 or 3 full-year awards annually, not enough to make headlines, exactly enough to change lives. None of this was announced. None of it was performed. It existed the way the ordered tools on the pegboard existed, not for observation, but because that was simply how things were done when you meant them. She was also, if she was honest with herself, drawn to the quality of his company in a way that she recognized as more than intellectual interest. She had dated, over the years, men who were impressive in the ways her world rewarded, articulate, ambitious, accustomed to the same rooms she occupied. Some of them had been kind. Most of them had understood, eventually, that she was not easily accommodated, that her work was not a temporary priority but a fundamental part of how she existed in the world, and that accommodation required either a level of security she didn't often encounter, or a willingness to be secondary that she suspected was unsustainable. 1 or 2 had asked her, not unkindly, to choose. She had chosen without drama or resentment, and gone back to work. And she had understood that this was probably a statement about her, though she was not entirely sure which statement it was. Ethan did not seem to require accommodation in either direction. He was not competing with her or deferring to her. He did not seem to need her to be smaller in order to feel large, which was rarer than it should have been. He was simply himself, at a consistent and undefended level that she found, the more she was around it, quietly remarkable. She invited him to the Carter Systems annual partners' dinner on an impulse, by text, on a Monday afternoon. She stared at the sent message for a moment, and then put her phone face down on her desk and did not look at it for 40 minutes. His reply came eventually. "Sure. Do I need a jacket?" She replied, "Yes." He replied, "All right." She spent the next 3 days telling herself it was a professional courtesy and not convincing herself at all. Ethan arrived at the Carter Systems partners' dinner in a dark jacket over a clean white shirt, and he looked different in it. Not unrecognizable, but as though the garage had been only one register of him and this was another. He moved through the room with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything, shaking hands without performance, listening carefully to people who introduced themselves with their titles and net worth embedded in their sentences. Lydia watched him from across the room for a while before approaching, and she noticed that people seemed to respond to him differently than they responded to each other, with less calculation, more straightforwardness, as though something about his manner made the usual social performances feel unnecessary. She brought him to the front of the room when it was time for the portion of the evening she had planned as a recognition segment. She had prepared remarks. They were good remarks, clear, specific, measured in the way her public communication always was. She talked about the past difficult months and the recovery. And she talked about the value of outside perspective and what it had meant to the company. And then, because she was who she was, and because she had spent 35 years learning to say true things in front of rooms full of people, she told the story of the Porsche. She told it accurately, and without embellishment, the breakdown on the rural road, the 7 specialists, the hand-painted sign, the oil-stained coveralls, the joke she had made that everyone had laughed at. She watched her audience, which was sophisticated and well-dressed and accustomed to polished narratives, leaned slightly forward as she spoke. She told them what Ethan had heard in the engine that no one else had. She told them what he had identified in her company that no one else had. She told them that the best decision she had made in a very difficult year was to take the advice of a local woman on the side of a road and go to a small garage on Route 9. "The joke I made that day," she said, looking at Ethan in a way that she had not planned but did not stop, "was that I would marry the man who fixed my Porsche." The room laughed, the way rooms laugh at a good callback. "I want to ask him in front of all of you, because I'm apparently incapable of doing anything quietly, if he remembers saying that he knew exactly where the problem was." Ethan, standing to the side of the podium, looked at her with an expression she had been trying to read for months and that, in this moment, she was suddenly certain about. He said, "I remember." She said, "Were you right?" He said, "The car runs fine." The room laughed again, softer this time. Lydia held his gaze. "I think you know I'm not asking about the car." The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they realize they are witnessing something that was not on the agenda. After the formal portion ended, and the room broke into the usual currents of conversation and dessert, and circulated business cards, Ethan found Lydia near the windows, overlooking the city. She had a glass of water and was looking at the lights. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking, in the way he often did, as though silence were not an absence but a form of attention. He said, eventually, "I want to tell you something I haven't told anyone here." She turned to look at him. He said, "I knew, from the first few times you came back to the garage, that you weren't there because the car needed work. I thought you were curious about the ClearPath situation, or that you wanted something professional." She didn't say anything. He said, "I kept waiting for you to ask for something, for there to be a purpose. Because that's usually how it works. In the world you come from, people have reasons for being in rooms." She said, "And?" He said, "And you just kept coming back. And there was never a purpose I could name. And I didn't know what to do with that." She said, "What did you do with it?" He said, "I started looking forward to Thursdays." She laughed, genuinely, unexpectedly, the laugh of something that had been held tight for a while, releasing at once. He was watching her when she laughed, the way he watched engines and problems, and the things he was trying to understand. She said, "I thought I was being very professional about all of this." He said, "You were professional about everything except the way you looked at the scholarship fund information." She said, "How did you know I'd found out about that?" He said, "Because you went very quiet for about 4 minutes, and then asked me an extremely specific question about technical education infrastructure." She said, "That was a professional question." He said, "You were also crying a little." She said, "I was not." He said, quietly, "You were. It was all right." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I'm going to tell you something. I'm not sure how to say." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "I have spent my entire adult life being very good at identifying what matters and then building structures around it so that it doesn't get away. And I've been doing that with this, with you, in my head for months. And I realize now that I was treating it like a problem to be managed. And it isn't." He said, "No." She said, "It isn't." There was a pause, in which the city below them moved at its own pace, and the room behind them carried on, and neither of them looked away. Then Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out something that he placed carefully in his palm and held toward her. It was not a ring in any traditional sense. It was a small, precisely machined component, an exact replica, rendered in brushed silver, of the relay housing from the Porsche's ignition system. The one he had found and corrected, the one that had started all of this. He said, "I had it made. About 2 months ago. I didn't know when I would. I wasn't certain you." He stopped. He said, "Lydia, you have been the most surprising thing to happen to me in a very long time. I am not in the same world as you by most measurements. I am aware of that. But I have thought about it, carefully, and I believe the measurement is wrong." She looked at what was in his hand. She looked at him. She said, "You made me. A relay housing." He said, "It's a proposal." She said, "From an ignition circuit." He said, "You're the one who brought the car in." She laughed again, the same real laugh. And she heard the room around them change in the way rooms change when something genuine happens inside them. She said yes. She said it clearly, without qualification, in the way she said the things she meant. They did not change dramatically. After that, Lydia kept her apartment in the city and her office at Carter Systems and her schedule, which remained unreasonable by most standards. Ethan kept the garage on Route 9, kept the hand-painted sign, kept the pegboard tools, kept the Thursday afternoon that he held open for anyone who couldn't afford standard labor rates. They built a life that was, by external observation, unconventional in its geography and its rhythms, and that was, in the experience of both of them, the first arrangement that had ever felt genuinely sustainable. It required, on her part, an acceptance that not everything important could be optimized or scheduled. It required, on his part, an acceptance that the world she moved in was not the world that had hurt him, that the rooms full of ambitious people were also full of people trying honestly to build something worth building. These were not small adjustments. They made them anyway, without drama, the way people who respect each other make difficult adjustments by talking about the difficulty and continuing. The foundation they built together was modest in its first year and grew steadily, funded partly by Lydia's resources and partly by donations that came in after the story of the conference, the reading of the document. The quiet man from the small garage made the rounds in the technology press in the way that genuinely surprising things occasionally do. 3 months after the partners' dinner, they established a joint foundation focused on technical education scholarships for young people from rural and low-income backgrounds, something that had, in a quiet way, been Ethan's work for years, and that now had the structure and resources to grow. Lydia ran the foundation strategy. Ethan chose the recipients, sitting across a small table from applicants in the back room of the garage, listening to them describe what they wanted to build and why, and giving them the same quality of attention he gave to every problem worth solving. There is a thing that gets said, often and easily, about not judging by appearances, a thing said so often that it risks becoming hollow, a phrase that substitutes for the actual work of seeing. The truth underneath it is harder than the saying. It requires a particular kind of discipline to look at someone in oil-stained coveralls in a small garage on a rural road and withhold the judgment that the surface invites. It requires the suspension of every shortcut the mind reaches for the credential check, the address check, the clothes check, all of the fast calculations that make social navigation efficient, and, in doing so, make genuine recognition less likely. Most people move through the world on those shortcuts. They are fast and they are reliable in narrow ways, and they miss almost everything that matters. Lydia Carter had built a career on her ability to see clearly, to identify the essential thing inside a complicated system and understand what it was actually doing. It had made her wealthy and effective and, in some rooms, formidable. It had not, until the afternoon her Porsche died on a 2-lane road, and a local woman told her about a garage on Route 9, taught her to apply that clarity to the question of what mattered most. Ethan Brooks had known, for a long time, that the things he valued could not be held by the structures other people had built to hold them. He had learned this at the cost of a company, a reputation, 2 years of his life in rooms with lawyers. He had learned it also at a more personal cost that he never described to anyone in detail. The cost of watching something he had made with genuine care be dismantled for reasons that had nothing to do with its worth. That experience had done what such experiences often do. It had stripped away the things that turned out not to be load-bearing. The ambition for recognition, the need to be seen as successful by people who defined success in ways that, when examined, didn't interest him much. What it left behind was simpler and more durable, the pleasure of a problem solved correctly, the satisfaction of work that was honest, the value of a person who showed up as themselves and didn't ask him to pretend otherwise. What he had found on the other side of that loss was not consolation but something more durable. The knowledge that the work itself, done with care, in the presence of the people it served, was its own sufficient reason. He had built a small life around that knowledge and kept it deliberately small, and it had been enough until a woman in an expensive blazer drove into his gravel lot in a broken $1 million car and laughed at him in a way that he found, for reasons he didn't immediately examine, more interesting than insulting. The day Lydia Carter said she would marry the man who fixed her Porsche, she thought she was telling a joke. The words had come out of a version of herself that was tired and impatient, and slightly performing for a room, the version that used humor as a form of distance, that wrapped genuine feeling in irony, because genuine feeling without irony felt, in the environments she occupied, too exposed. She had spent most of her adult life in rooms that rewarded composure and penalized anything that looked like need, and she had become very good at the composure and somewhat distant from everything it was composing over. The day she said it again in front of a room full of people who mattered to her professionally, and in the presence of the man who had become the most honest relationship of her adult life, she understood that the first time had been the joke, and the second time was the truth, and that the distance between those two moments was not time exactly, but seeing the specific, costly, irreversible kind that changes what you are able to perceive once you have done it. The man who had walked out of the small garage that first afternoon had not needed to announce himself. He had opened the hood and gone quiet and found the thing that everyone else had missed, and then he had fixed it, and then he had gone back to work, as he always did, as he always would. Some problems, after all, do not announce themselves. They wait quietly inside the machinery until someone who knows how to listen comes close enough to hear what the noise is actually saying. Ethan Brooks had always known how to listen. And Lydia Carter, in the end, had learned.